Hello, everybody. I hope you can hear me. And thank you to everybody who's joining us for today's meeting. I really appreciate you taking the time out of your schedule today to spend an hour with us. I hope you're all doing well and have had a good and productive week with some time for some rest and self-care. If you haven't already, please make sure that you've got your microphone and your video turned off. And just a reminder that the call is being recorded as well. As most of you know, Dale Wheeldon has had to step away from his duties at BCEDA after undergoing heart surgery last week. But he has been released from hospital a few days ago and is now recuperating at home. He's doing quite well, albeit he's probably already a little bit bored, he says. But we'll give him a lot more time to recuperate. And he's very appreciative of the thoughts and the well wishes that many of you have sent along. So, thank you so much for that. In the meantime, I'm stepping in to help out where I can with some of the activities that BCEDA is undertaking. I'm Colleen Bond, and I'm very happy to be here in Dale's absence and to provide you with the information that can help your communities while we're in this current situation and work towards developing responsive and economic recovery efforts to your economies there. So please use the chat box to ask any questions, or perhaps if you see a question being asked, feel free to type in an answer to that, and we'll have an interactive session that way as well. But we've got Ashley here who's also monitoring the chat throughout the call. We have got a pretty busy slate today. So quickly from last week's call, what we went through was a brief overview of BCEDA's activities. We provided information on the new programs that were announced, both federal and provincial, of course. And we had some really good information provided by the three speakers last week from the call. And we also received some really good feedback from you about the information that was provided. So we're really glad that there was some value there for many of you folks. Ashley continues to be very, very busy over the past week, ensuring that the BCEDA's COVID-19 webpage is up to date and includes all that information that you folks need to run your communities. And Ashley also does send out a COVID-19 bulletin 3 times a week that also provides really good, timely information with links and that sort of thing. So if you haven't signed up for that, please do so. It's got great information for you. For those who haven't had a chance to look at the COVID website recently or don't know about the BCEDA's resource guide, that is a 140-page plus document that's constantly being added to. It's really a live and living document. Now, we do understand, of course, that is a lot of information to wade through. So after listening to some of the feedback that we received from some of you, we've created a resource cheat sheet, if you will. And this is a simple one-pager that just provides you with some of the quick tips on response and recovery, as well as some of those top resource links that will give you that information that you need. So this one sheet is now on the COVID-19 webpage, so check that out as well when you've got some time. Another important item that we are working on is the development of a phase 2 COVID survey. So this is for your businesses. Now, I know some of you are actively engaging with your local businesses right now, and we strongly encourage that you continue to do that. What this phase 2 survey is going to do and be for you is really a useful tool to assist you and build on that first survey that was developed almost a month ago. That first survey had about a dozen questions, and now that it is, getting into about a month or so, we're finding it's a bit outdated given the constant evolving situation that we're in. The phase 2 survey really moves away from that immediate response and provides a mechanism to collect more information on how your businesses are doing. Are they aware of the various programs? Are they using them? What do they need? And what does their recovery look like? And what are the requirements for that? So, you know, a simple example would be to look at how the restaurant industry has really pivoted in so many ways over the past month. But once, you know, these restrictions start to ease and we start to want to go out into our communities again for dinner or casual drinks, you know, we know we're not going to immediately return to any sort of normal that we used to have. The social and physical distancing is still going to be a part of this new normal for quite some time, and businesses need to start thinking about that now. So again, you know, for the restaurant industry, maybe that means they need to create more outdoor seating. And if that's the case, then, you know, local governments now need to start looking at their current bylaws to see if that's something that needs to be changed or adapted or adjusted in any way to accommodate these new requirements. And through this phase 2 survey, it's really going to allow you to start to collect the information of your businesses for their recovery. Now, they may not have it figured out yet, likely not, right? They may not have those answers yet, but we need them to start to think about this. They need to start thinking about these new ideas and these new concepts for what our economy is really going to look like. There were a lot of announcements made over the past week. These are some of them here. We're just going to touch upon them very briefly. All of these are updated on the COVID-19 webpage, of course. There are financing support was announced to be provided through the regional development agencies. This, of course, includes Community Futures. So I've been in touch with them, and I understand the program details are being worked out, and we'll certainly keep in touch with that so we can pass the information on when it's available. Money has been dedicated to the arts and culture sector as well as sports. Also, investment is being dedicated and directed to charities and nonprofit organizations across Canada. The Canada Wage Subsidy Program, that now has an online calculator, so your businesses can get a better idea of what that really means for them. The BC Emergency Benefit for Workers, that was announced fairly early on. This is a one-time tax-free payment for BC residents who have been affected, and they will start taking the applications on May the 1st. There was also programming and support announced for Indigenous businesses, supports for young entrepreneurs, along with support for students and new graduates, and I think that was just announced yesterday. So this week, on today's call, we're going to focus on workforce, and we have two really good speakers for you folks that'll be providing us with information on the current situation, along with impacts moving forward, and really start to get us to think about how our workforce will change and the adjustments that we may need to be making. First up is Trudi Parsons, and she is with MDB Insight. Trudy has more than 25 years of experience in the economic development industry, along with industry-specific and workforce development experience at the local and regional, provincial levels, so all, national levels, all levels. And through her work, she works with communities to help them align their labor supply and demand, attract and retain talent, and create strategies for future success. So Trudy, if you're there and are able to unmute yourself, that would be great. And I will hand it over to you. Good, you're there, good. I'll hand it over to you and just let me know when you need me to advance your slides, and let's hear from you.
Sounds great. Thanks so much, Colleen, and thanks everyone for the opportunity to sit and have a bit of a conversation, I guess, over the next 15 minutes or so. I'll share some information about what's been keeping me awake at night, having worked in workforce development and labor market planning for probably over 2/3 of my career or longer. And as I start to see what's been transpiring, completely unexpectedly over the past few months. Colleen, if you could move forward. My last trip was actually to BC as I attended the BCEDA conference middle of March. And so been pretty grounded ever since. As soon as I got back, things started to shut down. Whoever would have imagined, when we think to the future, I think our thoughts are more about, technology changes and advancements and, flying cars and all of those great things. It's not, I don't think many of us ever sat back and thought about what would the next pandemic look like. But we're certainly living in a time that I'm sure many of us, if not all of us, have never really experienced before. And it's causing us to really sit back and think, about things that are going to be challenging us as we start to come out the other end of this, and think about the longer term impacts of what all this means, both from an economic development perspective as well as from a workforce perspective. Next slide, Colleen. So we know, and as Colleen mentioned, there's been a significant focus both from the federal and provincial government perspective on, how do we reduce the risk of COVID-19 in our communities, in our workplaces, and how do we start to prepare our economies to restart. We know that there will be significant impact to our existing businesses that we have in our communities. And we know that in some cases, there will be businesses that will choose not to restart. Maybe they were later in life and, really do not want to go back to sort of that step one and rebuild. We know that there will be businesses that will not have a choice. They just will not be able to restart due to the financial impact that these closures are having on non-essential businesses. And so I think about all of that, both from the economic impact perspective, the municipal impact with loss of taxes and revenues, the loss of services for communities and residents, and the loss of jobs for workers and job seekers. It's very clear to me that, there will be businesses that will ramp back up and some more quickly than others. And those businesses will call back the individuals that they have laid off. And those folks, will get back to work in a new way of working. But I really worry about those that are going to be impacted by the business closures or the business downsizing, and those individuals that, up until beginning of March, middle of March, had a job, and now all of a sudden they find themselves unemployed and really uncertain of what their future looks like, both from an employment perspective as well as being able to compete in the labor market. Next slide, Colleen. And we've seen the impact. I mean, this number here, 8.38 million of total applications processed by Service Canada and CRA as of April 19th. So just, not even a week ago, these are the number of applications that they have processed. So it just helps us to understand, when we think about that number, the implication, the story behind that number, and the people and the families that this has actually impacted. And so one of the things that we at MDB has been doing and spending a lot of time about is trying to understand, what that impact looks like. Next slide, Colleen. So we have a platform, and you may be familiar with this platform, some of you at least. It's a platform available through a company called Vicinity Jobs. And Vicinity Jobs is actually an LMI data provider to the government of British Columbia. They've been using this platform now, I think, for about the past 4 years or so, and just most recently went to an RFP, and Vicinity was awarded the contract looking out over the next few years as well. And so what we did, Vicinity gives us the opportunity to look at the data quarterly, monthly, and most recently to look at the data on a week-by-week basis. So the data that you see presented here looks at the data out to April the 11th. And if you look to the right side of the slide here, just looking at the share numbers, you can see the impact. This is for Vancouver specifically, looking at the weekly job postings. And when we look at the period of April 5th to the 11th, almost 2,000 jobs less that have been posted in that time period. But we also see that there have been jobs that have been posted, in that later time period, looking at about 680. So we do know that even amidst all of this closures and downsizing, that we are seeing businesses still looking to hire individuals. And, while we won't get into this today, but we have the ability to look at what are those job postings, what types of jobs are they, what are the skills that employers are looking for right now as they work through pandemic, as many of them pivot on a dime to change their product services and to, build or manufacture or produce things that they may never have produced in the past, but are now stepping in and stepping up and contributing to where the need is the greatest. This is only to April 11th. And we know that, there have been more businesses that have been impacted, that have closed, since that date. So we know that that number is only going to increase, and it's going to have a significant impact on the unemployment rate, not just for BC, but right across Canada. Next slide, Colleen. This gives a similar story, but this is looking at Kelowna. And again, you can see significant decline, about 300 jobs over that, 1 week period. And you can see that the numbers were fairly consistent, looking all the way back to, late February. You can see, 2019 and then looking to 2020, where there was starting to be a decline. But we can certainly see that, we're landing in April with just 96 job postings. Next slide, Colleen. This next slide looks at Kitimat, where the numbers are much smaller, but it's also looking at a smaller community. And again, the devastation of losing 2 jobs, 3 jobs, 4 jobs in these communities is heartfelt. And, to look at these numbers again, 30 jobs between that April 2nd and April 15th time period. So I just wanted to share with you that there is data available to help you understand, the job impact at this stage in the pandemic, looking at some comparisons to where things were last year to this year, and looking at a series of other data points that would help us understand, perhaps where the greatest need is for our businesses in our communities, and how might this information inform our strategies and thinking about what needs to happen next. Next slide, Colleen. So, the greatest value right now is ensuring that we are making decisions based on, what we understand to be true. And the more that we can ground that type of information into evidence, whether it's through surveys, whether it's through collection of, primary data, looking at data points, the greater, I think, the impact will have on the solutions and the strategies and the next steps that we start to identify as we work to support our communities and our businesses to come out the other end of this. Next slide, Colleen. So I've actually spoken to this one. We can just move on to the next one. So what's keeping me awake at night? Well, I'm sure we're sharing a lot of the same questions. Who are the individuals that have been displaced? We know that certainly, as Colleen mentioned early in this presentation, certainly we know that our hospitality, our tourism sector, we know a lot of our service industries have been significantly impacted, but we've also seen impacts in, large corporations where, Ford has closed plants, or, our airline industry has been impacted. So I think, one of the first questions that comes to my mind is, who are those that have been displaced? How many of them will actually return to the workforce in short order? So how many of the businesses that have closed are actually going to be in a position to start up quickly as soon as, permission is granted for them to do so? And how many individuals will remain displaced, either because less workers are needed as those businesses start back up, or those businesses are just not starting back up at all? And so those individuals find themselves, to be remaining in that unemployed status. Next slide, Colleen. And what's the impact of that talent displacement on businesses? So, one of the things that I think a lot about is, what's the mind shift that needs to be happening both at the business level and at the employee or job seeker level? Because how we go back and how we work, certainly in the shorter term, is going to be very different than how we worked, in beginning of February or even the beginning of March. I know in conversations with businesses, they're talking about how do they position themselves so that they're not going to face this crisis should it ever happen again in the same way. They're looking at how to introduce AI, how to introduce technology as a means of doing some of the work that perhaps people were doing in the past. So I think we're going to start to see a faster shift. Not to say that it hasn't been happening, but I think we're going to see a faster shift in how businesses are operating and how we're starting to see technology and things like AI introduced into workplaces where perhaps it may have been a future plan, but it's now becoming a more shorter term plan. And then I think about, well, what's the role of economic development in all of this? And I mean, first and foremost, our economic development professionals across the country are really, putting heads together and trying to figure out what do we need to do to get businesses started back up. And then, as important as that is, how do we make sure businesses have what it is that they need to be able to successfully get back to business? And a key component of that is absolutely going to be, the people side of what they need in order to operate. So we need to, be thinking a lot about this. We need to be trying to find ways to validate, responses to these questions and not just doing it, solely on anecdotal. And so, next slide, Colleen. Thanks. So one of the things that we have done, as I said, I've been in this business a really long time working with labor market planning and workforce development. And I've had the pleasure to meet some great folks from across the country. And so, one of the things that I felt was really important was how do we kickstart or fuel, where it has started, the conversation around preparing Canada's workforce to come out the other side of this pandemic, stronger and resilient is the word that always comes to my mind. And so I'll share with you that on May 13th, we will be hosting a live webinar through Workforce Central Canada. Workforce Central Canada is a partnership, and you can see the partners listed across the bottom there, including our friends from the US, the National Association of Workforce Boards, where, just as an FYI, in the US, there's about 650 workforce investment boards that exist at the state and county level. And those boards work collaboratively with the federal government to provide the appropriate services, programming, support, learning, to, in essence, get people back to work. And so we've tapped into that association on a number of different projects over the past few years. And collectively, we have formed Workforce Central Canada, which is still in its infancy stages, but will be hosting this workforce forum. It'll be an hour-long forum where, again, you can have the opportunity to ask questions either in advance, as you can see there from ask@workforcecentral.ca, or during the forum, similar to what we're doing right now. So I will ensure that this information is shared with Colleen and Ashley and BCEDA, and hopefully we can get it distributed so that if this is something that is of significant interest or that you have an interest in, we can make sure that you get the information sent to you, and hopefully free up an hour on May 13th and participate. You can see some of the panelists that are going to be joining us for that, including Stephen Tobin with the Labor Market Information Council. You know, and my conversation most recently with Stephen just reiterated that we really don't know the full impact that this is going to have on the workforce yet. And we're really grappling with that understanding of what that might be. And if we collectively have these conversations and put these questions out there, then collectively we can hopefully share some best practice or promising practices that can help all of our communities across Canada be successful. Next slide, Colleen. And there you go. My contact information, certainly feel free to reach out if there's any questions, or happy to have any conversations or discussions. And thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity to share some of what's preventing me from sleeping a full night these days. I'll pass it back to you, Colleen.
Thanks so much, Trudy. That was really some really good information there. And the one huge takeaway for me is we don't know, you know, and there's nothing for us from the past to let us know how things are going to change and how quickly they may change. Now, I was going to hold off on the questions until after Ken speaks as well, because I think there's some really good perspective to hear from both of you. But there was one question, Trudy, that came up that is specific to your presentation. And there was just a question wondering how individual communities can access job posting data that you showed for Vancouver, Kelowna, and Kitimat.
Thank you. So Vicinity Jobs is a subscription. So while the BC government has access and to the full data set, my understanding is that they are restricted in how they distribute it out to the community level. But certainly if anyone is interested in getting some details around that, you know, either for their community or for their region, it doesn't have to be restricted just to their community. So for instance, right now, the Cariboo Regional District has the data for the whole region. And so communities in that region can, you know, get exactly the data that I've been sharing here. And we can also produce sort of, you know, like a one-of report if there was a community that just wanted to get a snapshot of what a, you know, particular point in time might have looked like. So feel free to reach out either by email or give me a call on my my number that you see on the screen there, and I'm happy to offer some insight around that.
Great, thanks, Trudy. And also for communities, you might want to, if BC, the provincial government, does have access to the data, it might be worth a reach out and a call to your regional managers as well at the provincial level and see if they've got some information that they can pass on. What we're going to do is yeah, we're going to move on now to Ken Peacock. And Ken is the Chief Economist and Vice President of the BC Business Council. Ken contributes to the Council's work on economic and policy issues for the in the interest of the of the business community. And he's got some really good information to share on workforce and where we are now and where we're going. So Ken, if you're unmuted, we are able to pass it on to you and let you get going.
I am unmuted. Can you hear me okay?
Perfect.
Okay, good. Well, thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for having me. Thanks for the invitation. I appreciate it. The plan, I've got a fair number of slides. Some of them I'll skip over because some of the material's already been covered in different ways. But just by way of background, just so people on the call know, in case they're not familiar with the Business Council, we're essentially a trade association for large and medium-sized businesses in the province. We have about 250 members. That does include universities and colleges around the province, as well as other public sector agencies such as Hydro. But for the most part, private large businesses is our membership base, and we interface and deal with the provincial government a fair amount, and the federal government less so, but in today's world, more so than usual. So let's just jump into the next slide, Colleen. Just some background. The big challenge for this, and we've been on this and worrying about this right from the outset of the pandemic, is that the countries and regions are at different stages of infection, different stages of flattening the curve, a term that we've all heard multiple times. So this is going to be one of the big challenges in reopening air travel, international air travel. Just the fact that countries are all at different processes and different stages, to my mind, that is going to be a big factor in slowing the opening up, and I would include the border in this, and getting the sort of global economy back to a more normal place. I don't think we're ever going to return back to normal, at least not in the near term. But this fragmented and different stage of the breakout, I think, is going to be a big challenge. As we all know, governments have shuttered large parts of the economies. The global economy is headed for a sharp but hopefully temporary recession. The thing here is it's now very clear and evident that this recession is going to be much deeper than the 2008-2009 financial crisis. We'll get into some more numbers in a moment. Most forecasters are pointing to some recovery in the second half of 2020, but this is a little bit uncertain. And Trudy was touching on this in terms of labor market recovery and jobs recovery. It's just not clear how this is going to unfold, and there's many reasons for that, risks of a second breakout and whatnot. So like I said, most forecasters are expecting a recovery in the second half of the year. The strength of the recovery is widely debated. I'm now in the camp, and have been for some time, that this is not a snapback recovery. It's not a so-called V-shaped recovery. It's going to be slow, and I'll get into some of the reasons I think it's going to be a slow and more protracted and somewhat uneven recovery in a moment. And I think good news for us is looking around other jurisdictions around the globe, both in terms of the impact of the virus as well as the impact of the closures on the economy. I would assess and judge that BC is better positioned than most other provinces, at least many of the other provinces, as well as the US states. And on balance, we are doing very well. We've been very well served by our medical health officer, of course, Dr. Bonnie Henry, as well as our politicians and the system that BC has in place. So I think people can take some solace and some reassurance that BC is relatively well positioned. Having said that, of course, this is going to be a very steep and deep recession. Next slide, and I'll try and move it along a little more quickly now. This is just some numbers that came out of the IMF recently in terms of global economic growth and projections. The first line there is world economic growth. And as you can see clearly, in 2020, the IMF now expects the global economy to contract by 3%. US by close to 6%, Canada by 6% as well, Euro area 7.5%. These are large decreases, very significant recession here, much larger than anything we saw in the financial crisis. And just to note, typically at the global level, a recession, if the global economy grows by around 2%, that's recession territory, just because we don't usually see a downturn in emerging economies. So even when the global economy expands by 1.5 or 2%, economists will call that a recession. That just gives you some sense or perspective when we're in negative 3% territory, just how deep this recession is expected to be. And as I was mentioning a moment ago, there is a snapback or some rebound, maybe not a snapback, a rebound expected in 2021. So if that materializes, that will be most welcome. But again, this recovery process, I think, is going to be slow. Next slide. Just a quick snapshot on what countries are doing. Here we have the amount of economic packages, the dollar value of economic packages and fiscal measures as a percent of GDP. So that's relative to the sizes of the different economies. Canada at about 8.2% of expenditures relative to the size of the economy so far. Not as much as you see in some other economies. Germany standing out as having done the most so far to kind of prop up and stabilize its economy, but Canada has a reasonable amount of stimulus. The United Kingdom, you can see there, not so much. Next slide. So into employment projections, the line has disappeared here in the translation, but you can get the idea from looking at the dots. Most people on the call will be aware that in March, Statistics Canada's labor force survey pointed to a steep plunge in employment right across Canada. And here in BC, we lost 132,000 jobs in a single month. Absolutely massive job destruction, job loss, some of them temporary, some of them furloughed, whatever they may be. This is unprecedented and massive. I do expect additional job losses in the months ahead. Main reason for this is Statistics Canada's labor force survey was conducted up to the week ending on March 21st, or that week. And we didn't announce our closures. I think the emergency, a state of emergency was declared on the 18th, and restaurants, I believe, were closed on the 20th. So we didn't really capture the full impact of the shutdown, is all I'm saying. So we do anticipate more sizable job losses in the coming months. And then you can see there the scenario that's outlined here for our projection is some recovery in employment in the second half of the year, depending on how closures are unlocked and how the economy is unlocked will depend on the profile of the recovery. But as you can see, we're not expecting a big rebound in employment at this point. Next slide. The unemployment rate is easily going to surge to between 11, 12%, up to 16%, and it is possible it could go as high as 20%. Many commentators in the US are pointing to a 20 or 25% unemployment rate in the US. We could see similar numbers up here, but as of now, I'm thinking somewhere between 12 and 16%. We'll see our unemployment rate peak. Next slide. And just again, for context of the magnitude of job destruction here, we have total employment shown in the bars over the past couple decades from 2001 to 2020. You can see in 2019 and 2018 and 2017 as well, we had pretty strong job growth in the province. And employment was on a strong upward trajectory in the second half of the teen decade there. But now employment has fallen on the more optimistic end of the scale. We might only see 3 or 4 years of job losses in a single year, or sorry, of job growth destroyed in a single year. But if we see more substantial job creases, we could be taking, BC could be going back to an employment level that we saw back in 2012 and conceivably even 2008. So this is going to take a long time to regain those lost jobs and to rebuild. And you can see there in the 2009, 2010, 2011 recovery period in the wake of the financial crisis and Great Recession, that indeed employment growth was quite slow, and it was a slow recovery process in terms of getting more people in the job market and building up employment levels. I anticipate some elements of a slow recovery. There will be a snapback when restaurants and things are reopened, but there will also be this kind of slow, meandering recovery in the job market is what I would anticipate at this point. Next slide, we'll get a little bit into some of the details of individuals. Oh, unfortunately, only one of the bars showed up. But the key point of this slide is by far the job losses are concentrated in the private sector. And this is not a newsflash for anybody on the line, but I think it is important just to underscore that fact. When policymakers are grappling with rebuilding the economy and getting people back to work, it's going to be important to recognize this is a private sector phenomena. We saw this isn't to ignore public sector job losses. There's definitely job losses in the public sector, the most obvious being, parks and recreation at municipalities around the province. In total, about 5,000 jobs in the broad public sector were lost in March. But again, if you contrast that to the private sector, we saw 135,000 jobs lost in the private sector. So by and large, this is a private sector phenomena, and that's where resources are going to need to be directed for this recovery. Next slide. And just getting into some of the details of who's impacted. On the left panel there, the red bars, that is a breakdown of the job losses between February and March by broad age groups or broad age cohorts. And you can see there the 15 to 24 age category and the 25 to 54 age category both lost around 50,000 jobs. And for those 55 and over, employment levels fell by about 30,000. So big reductions across the board, but of course these cohorts aren't equally sized. So when you take into consideration the fact that the 25 to 54 age group is not surprisingly, it's at least 4.5 times the size of that 15 to 24 age cohort. So when you look at it in percentage terms, it really does emerge and show up that the 15 to 24 year age cohort, younger workers in this province have by far taken the biggest hit, with employment down in that age category almost 15% in a single month. And as I was saying a moment ago, there's going to be future job losses in the coming months, additional job losses. So we could see employment in that 15 to 24 age group fall by 20-25% very, very easily by the time this is all done. Next slide. And just before we go to the next slide, I will add additional comment that it's interesting. The 3.2% decline is a very, very large decrease. We actually don't even see job losses on a yearly basis of that magnitude. So do not want to diminish that by any stretch, but it is much, much less than the younger people, and 3.2%, not a huge impact at this stage. So people in those working years, typically more full-time jobs, not as many people in the more precarious jobs in the sectors that have been hard hit, obviously food and accommodation, and some other recreational services standing out as being especially hard hit. Next slide. And just a longer term perspective, this is the actual number of people employed between the ages of 15 and 24 years of age. And again, I would draw your attention to strong job growth between, say, 2003-4 up to 2008 when the financial crisis hit. And then we had the global recession, and the number of people working, the young people working, fell sharply. And as I was saying before, very slow to recover. Took at least 8 or 9 years for this cohort to regain previous employment levels. So very, very slow. Then they had a few years of decent job growth, but kind of sideways. And then I think it is important to recognize and understand going into this pandemic and the shuttering of consumer-facing businesses and other non-essential businesses, the job market in BC was already slowing and softening, and it's evident here. You can see a fairly significant downward move in the number of people working in this age group in the 5 or 6 months, maybe even 7 or 8 months leading up to March. So we go into this pandemic not especially well positioned in terms of the strength of the economy. And that is also something that I think we're going to have to take into consideration as we work to rebuild and reopen our economy here in the province. Next slide. Just a few thoughts and comments on the biggest hit. By now, most people on the call will be aware, air transportation industry, very, very hard hit. Flights, air traffic down as much as 90%. Airlines are reporting huge hits to revenue. There's going to be government bailouts in the airline space. Almost certainly, you're going to see them here in Canada. And I think it's just for people's interest on the line, if you look at what was driving the provincial economy and what the growth areas were before the pandemic hit, air transportation is one of the largest. We saw big gains in air transportation activity. YVR is being expanded. There was a huge capital plan announced for YVR about 6 months ago, another $20 billion in expansion. So this really was an economic engine in the province, and that has essentially been eviscerated. Similarly, the accommodation sector, hospitality sector, tourism in generally was a strong growth area. It shows up as one of the stronger growth industries, growth sectors in the province up to 2019. And again, this is an area that has been especially hard hit. The hospitality area, large gatherings, of course, are not going to be coming back anytime soon. Theaters are going to be very slow to open. Entertainment, leisure, also hard hit. Film and television production is an interesting. This sector in the province was growing at a pace I almost can't even explain or understand. It was expanding at a year-over-year rate of in excess of 15%. And if you just look at the more recent years, it grew as much as 20 or 25% each year for several years. This industry was booming. And when the pandemic hit, it all but shut down and packed up and left the province. So this too leaves a big hole. It is an area where we could probably get back up and operating relatively quickly, but I think the Canada-US border is going to be a consideration here, and just whether or not film production can be done with physical distancing, which I would imagine it probably can, will feature into just how quickly we can get that sector up and running again. And then we get further down, of course, retail trade was hard hit, but we get further down the list and you get into some secondary or other negative implications from the closures. And here I would just note, I sort of skipped over it in the beginning, but one way to think about this recession and to try and conceptualize just the magnitude of it is first off, the first impacts and first order effects are the result of the closing of non-essential businesses. That is a huge, huge impact. But because this is also happening around the globe, we are going to have a global recession. So we are battling and facing a circumstance where we essentially are going to have what amounts to a traditional recession, in the sense the global economy is weak and arguably weaker than any time in the recent memory. And then on top of it, we have the shuttering of these consumer-facing businesses. And it is important to note and recognize here, typically in a recession, what you see is consumer spending on large durable items fall. Automobiles, furniture, computers, other large ticket items. That tends to fall in a recession. What does not fall and is much more stable is spending on services, consumer services. And so this is, guess what? Haircuts, beauty salons, restaurants, bars, and just a host of other consumer services. That is very stable in a recession, but this time around, that is not the case. That too has fallen precipitously. It's not zero, but it's very, very low compared to what is traditional. So this is why right from the outset, we at the Business Council have been saying this recession is going to be nasty. Next slide, and I'm going to go over a couple ones fairly quickly. We don't need to talk too much about these scenarios, but I will just point out that early on in March, we came out with a couple scenarios and a couple forecasts. One, we envisioned the provincial economy contracting by around 7%. And under this scenario, this is where the global economy kind of bottoms over the summer and then starts to recover in the third quarter. And we also see some reopening of businesses in the province in the summer. More dire scenario, where we get an outbreak and a resurgence of the virus, big travel restrictions right through towards the end of the year, then we could see the provincial economy contracting by as much as 10 to 12%, a more dire. I think things are looking pretty good. I tend to lean towards more a 7 to 8% contraction these days. Still obviously very, very large, but I'm hoping we can avoid any sort of double-digit contraction in the province. Next slide. I'm not going to go over these. I just had a couple slides on programs. You people covered this off in detail in last week's meeting, so I will just jump over that. The only comment I will make is the Canada Wage Program, 75%, very, very welcome. When the federal government first came out with its 10% amount, I thought to myself, wow, we are going to see massive job destruction, and that's going to do very little to save any jobs. Then a few days later, they increased the subsidy up to 75% to a maximum of $847 a week. This will help save jobs. This will retain jobs, but it's not going to save all jobs. I think part of what we have to come to terms with is government is not going to be able to save every business and every job in the country or in the province. And similarly, government is not going to be able to fully eradicate or stop this virus absent a very effective vaccine. So we have to find balance in between those 2 points and places. Next slide, and I think we're going to be skipping over that one as well. Yeah, this is BC government initiatives. Let's go back one and just see what that one was. So these are just sort of some thoughts that are kind of help formulate our thinking about a rebuilding plan. I think we're going to, policymakers, particularly at the provincial level, but at the local level as well, and certainly at the federal level, are going to need to give top priority to an economic recovery rebuilding strategy for at least the next 2 years. And we've, at the Business Council, have been talking in terms of literally fighting for every dollar of incremental GDP and every job over the next 18 to 24 months. As I said, and as Trudy mentioned, the job destruction is almost difficult to imagine and comprehend. So we really will be struggling and fighting for every job. Rebuilding will start on a selective basis. This is pretty clear. We're seeing that in Europe, and Saskatchewan just came out with its rebuilding strategy, which I have a slide on in a moment with a couple points. But really, we need to buckle down and pay attention to rebuilding and getting the economy back on track. And one of the reasons I say this is the longer people are unemployed, the longer businesses are shuttered, the more destruction of institutional capital, the more destruction of business capital, the more destruction of businesses we have. And the evidence in the literature is very, very clear on unemployment. The longer people are unemployed, the more their skills atrophy, the more the scarring takes place, the more difficult it is to get back into the job market. And we really are in a circumstance now where we risk scarring and damaging an entire generation that is just entering the labor market, and people that are also struggling in the labor market today, even if they have been working for many, many years. So to our mind, it's going to be important, full speed ahead, protect not every job, but as many jobs as possible, so we can come out of this thing as much intact as possible and as whole as possible. Next slide. I think it might be the final slide. Oh, this is just a survey. We did this in cooperation with the BC Chamber of Commerce and the Business Council. We surveyed businesses as to what the provincial government's measures would be most helpful in keeping your businesses operational. You can see the items there and the proportion of responses. Reducing tax rates is big for our tax rates both on businesses and households. And the other item that stands up, and we hear repeatedly from our members, is this delay or cancel any planned or additional legislative or regulatory changes. So stop the process of consultation to introduce new regulations and processes. That should not be the focus. The focus should be squarely on getting people back to work and getting businesses back up and operating. Direct support to BC's hard-hit industries is also a frequently cited item that would be most helpful for businesses. and then freeze business municipal property taxes and allow for payment deferral is also in the top 4 or 5 items that businesses identified as being helpful to keep their businesses operating. I'll leave that for you to review the rest. And then next slide should be the final slide. Local government. Well, there's a few thoughts on local government. As we know, the federal government has most of the taxing authority and revenue raising capacity. So a lot of policies are going to fall, rebuilding policies are going to fall in their bailiwick. That is where the most of the funding for this rebuilding effort will come from. The province is second. Local government, of course, has a more limited role, limited revenue raising capacity, can't run deficits. But it is going to be important for local governments to, as much as possible, reduce fees and other costs for businesses and look to speeding up permitting processes as much as possible. And that may even include things like have pre-zoned land available for development. And one thing that I think is going to be a concern, local government is going to be looking for support from the provincial government. At the same time, provincial government is going to be under a great deal of pressure to increase expenditures. At the end of the day, they have finite resources, and my expectation is there will not be a whole bunch of money available for local government support. There may be some, but there is not going to be a big pool or pot of money available and distributed out. And then finally, the final slide now. I just found this today, and I thought it might be of interest to people on the call if you have not seen it yet. Saskatchewan released its recovery plan. It is by no means comprehensive and complete, and there's a lot of question marks in it, but it's interesting nonetheless. I imagine in BC will follow a similar type pattern. The first phase is reopening medical services, and they anticipate that occurring on May 4th, so not too far from now. Golf courses on May 15th, and parks and campgrounds to be opened on June 1st. The second phase of reopening is retail and some personal services and haircuts, and I believe nails were included in nail salons were included in those personal services. That's not happening until May 19th. And then we get into the more uncertain realm. The third phase is the reopening of restaurants. In the document, they say that will happen with 50% capacity. They'll also be looking to open licensed establishments, gyms, childcare facilities, and they'll allow gatherings of up to 15 people. But here's the catch. All these dates, or the date for the reopening of those bits of the economy, are to be determined. So they will announce those as they become more confident is appropriate to open those. And then phase 4, we get into the big recreational facilities, sporting events, entertainment facilities, theaters, and other things. That date is also to be determined. And then finally, phase 5, they consider lifting longer term restrictions, and that longer term restriction bucket includes strongly discouraging international travel, having to quarantine, care facilities, and other things. So I envision BC will follow a similar thing. Our timing could be similar, but it is not at all clear that restaurants will be opening within the next 2 or 3 weeks. It'll probably be further out. All this says that the challenges of reopening and preserving jobs and minimizing job loss and job destruction are going to be very, very difficult. And the longer we stay closed, the more destruction of capital and businesses we will see. And with that, I know we're already bumping up against 3 o'clock, so I'll wrap it up and go back to you, Colleen.
Okay, thanks so much, Ken. That was a lot of information, really valuable and really interesting for sure, especially at that local level and what can be done. I do have a few questions. I'll make them really as quick as we can to stay to our 3 o'clock or as close as we can. And this is for both you or Trudy. And one of the questions that was sent directly to me was, what are the changes today that will stay permanently in our workforce? So what are those changes? Maybe it's working remotely from home, that sort of thing. But what will stay, do you think, moving forward? And what are the aftershocks that we can expect from that?
Yeah, so I'll jump in. I'll just say one thing that's helped me sort of think about this whole circumstance, and I find I have to have kind of new frameworks for thinking because this is such a new world and so unprecedented. But I think one thing that's evident is trends that were in place are being accelerated, and being accelerated by as much as a decade or two. And I'll go to a couple obvious examples. Working remotely. There was already people working remotely, businesses pushing for that. My TELUS was well along the line in advancing that. But this crisis and this pandemic has accelerated that dramatically. So I don't think we're going to go fully back. I don't think people are going to continue to work only remotely, but we are recognizing that we can be productive, and these types of meetings and webinars can be efficient, save time commuting to hours. So I think you're going to see that. Similarly, you look to retail spending, that trend is being accelerated, more online spending. So just look to things that were kind of already in place in society and the workforce, and then just magnify those. It would be a sort of a good way to conceptualize it, I would say. So we're going to see more people working at home. We're going to see probably excess office space in a lot of places, a lot of downtown cores. A lot of businesses are going to realize they don't need all that office space. So that's going to have some implications for commercial space. Other things like that, I don't want to take too much time, and I'll leave it for Trudy.
So I'll just add two things that I agree with everything, Ken, that you've said. I think we're going to see an acceleration of AI introduced into the workplace. I think we're going to see things like robots, in a lot of retail. They already exist in Lowe's as an example. So I can see more of that happening, which is going to have, a negative impact on jobs for workers. I also think that from an employer perspective, we're going to see a significant increase in the demand for skills around computer literacy, technology, use of technology, things of that nature. So, both from the employer side as well as from the employee side, I think that it's going to be several years of significant transition.
Right. Yeah, I agree. And I'll just add one more thing, just because it's changed so dramatically. But when I was giving presentations up to March of this year, I always had a few slides on the low unemployment rate, tight labor market conditions, and the number of job openings, because the number of job openings was growing over time because there wasn't enough people to fill those spaces. Employers were having trouble finding employees. I think that whole notion of skill shortages is going to change dramatically. We still will see pockets of difficulty finding the right skills, but this notion of widespread skill shortages is essentially evaporated, and we now have the opposite problem.
And just to close off on that is going to have both an opportunity and an impact on our training institutions and post-secondaries, because we know when unemployment rates are higher, people tend to return back to learning as a means of preparing themselves for that next career. So
absolutely, Trudy, absolutely. I actually, so just to build, I guess we got to let another question come in, but just to build on what you're saying, I think that the province is going to have to devote a whole bunch of resources to retraining and education. And one thing that I think is a bit of an open question is many of our post-secondary institutions, if not most, rely heavily on foreign students as a revenue source and a source of cross-subsidization for the domestic student population. It's not clear to me what the demand and appetite for from overseas is going to be for foreign students. So we may see that diminish over time, and we may have excess capacity in our post-secondary institutions. The timing of that could be good, but I think it's going to require the province to step up and really, really fund people to get people in domestic students in the post-secondary system.
Okay, well, just to tag on to the opportunity side of things, and I think you're both right with regards to the training opportunities that some communities have, and hopefully they've got those strong partnerships with their businesses and their institutions that will be offering that training. But when you look at the communities, one of the questions that we did have that came in again was, what are those opportunities? So we've addressed training, but what are those opportunities that communities can look at today to make sure that they sort of get back to creating the workforce that's going to be needed? And I know we don't really know what that means, but you know, what are the priorities that communities could be doing right now?
So if I can really quickly jump in, I think the biggest thing right now is that if I was unemployed or I was an agency supporting clients who are unemployed, is I would be strongly encouraging, you know, strengthening my technology skills and strengthening my computer literacy, because I think those are going to be essential. Even in a work from home scenario, you know, technology has taken over our daily lives. I'm sure folks on this call, the fact that we're participating in, you know, Zoom calls and webinars, and I mean, you know, the speed at which that was introduced and the speed at which we needed to get up to speed on using those technologies has just, you know, accelerated.
It absolutely has. I will add, I will just jump in and say we also have to be sensitive and reckon to the reality that many jobs are not able to be performed remotely. Many jobs require on-site location. Lots of that is true in retail. Lots of that is, if you look at where we've seen the biggest negative employment impacts, those are often jobs where you do have to go into a location or a place. So again, back to the theme of preserving as many businesses as possible so that people do have jobs to go back to. I think we're talking to such a diverse group of people here on the call because communities are so different in terms of their economic base, in terms of their size, their population, their workforce. It's a little difficult to kind of be too prescriptive, but I do think the reality is communities, and this includes the BC economy as a whole, that depend on tourism quite heavily, are going to face more challenges, and they're going to have to look to creative ways, because I don't see international tourism coming back in any meaningful way right through the end of this year. I think there are going to be heavy restrictions on international mobility and flying. Quarantining and stuff will continue. So we are going to have to look to sort of a domestic tourism agenda. Communities may want to work together and see what that looks like for any asks from the province for support for that sector. I would also be looking to construction and building. Residential construction, to the extent that's possible, is a great thing. The province will almost certainly be pursuing an agenda of building as many rental homes as possible, and that will extend to most communities across the province. So I would tap into that. And I would be looking to our traditional economic engines, the things that we are good at here in BC that we can sell to other jurisdictions. That is going to be something that should anchor everybody's thinking. And that doesn't have to be international jurisdictions. It can be to other provinces, and it can also be a smaller community in the north selling goods or services to the extent possible to other parts of the province. That is where we're going to see the elements of rebuilding. I know there's not a lot of specifics there, but that's, I think, how we have to be thinking when we approach this.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. We're almost 10 minutes over, but there was some really good information there, and wanted to get in at least a couple of the questions that came in. So I do want to thank specifically you, Trudy, and Ken for joining us and providing that information for us. It was very valuable. And thank you to everybody else for joining us today. If you'd like to get in touch with us, please do so. We're happy to continue the conversation on in any way, but please look after yourself. Be safe and take care. Thanks so much.
Thank you.